Thanks for coming. My name's Becky Reid, and I am a musician and UX designer, and also a poll worker for the state of New Jersey. And that is how I came to be a witness to this very exciting story that has been stretching out for more than a year already of how we design and use ballots to vote for primaries in New Jersey. So I'm just going to start from the beginning because maybe not everybody has all this context. Right? Hit the button and the slide advances. All right. So famously, the lawsuit that has been in the news lately is the one brought by Andy Kim and Sarah Schoengood and several other parties, but there were actually lawsuits before this one. And so one of the lawsuits that I'd like to mention to give context is the one brought by Christine Conforti in 2020 when she was running for New Jersey's 4th congressional district. She was running for this district right over here, which is roughly Ocean County or Atlantic County and stretching all the way across the Trenton. So she was not favored by the county Democratic Party. And so she wasn't appearing on what is famously referred to as the county line. So she was suing because she felt that it was unfair. But her situation is very interesting, and we're going to come back to her later. So there were already lawsuits seeking to abolish the county line, but they were not actually going anywhere until this one that happened last year. Right. So now we come to Andy Kim, who had already been elected to New Jersey's 3rd congressional district. He's actually been my congressman. And when he was running for Senate, he was running against the governor's wife. And so the governor's wife was being put on the county line by Democratic Party officials for various counties. And he felt that it was unfair because some of these counties were actually choosing their candidates without any direct input from the voters or the public. Many counties have what's called a county committee that sends representatives from the county to vote on which candidates are going to be put on this party line, but several of them don't do that, such as Camden County. So he was suing because he felt that she was being given an unfair advantage. So that's your quick context. So he sued 19 out of 21 of these county clerks in February, which is not quite, it's pretty early in the election process. It's enough time to do something about it. So he was suing for an injunction to abolish the county line. So now that we're asking that, what is the county line? Have any of you actually heard of this already? Like I know there's been a lot of talk about it for years, but maybe not everyone is familiar. So unlike other states, which group their candidates together by the office that each candidate is running from, so you have all of your people running for 3rd congressional district seat, you have all the people running for Senate, you have all the people running for school board in this column, grouping the candidates together in that way. Instead, New Jersey runs their primaries so that they look like the general election ballot. So instead of having columns where you might have the Democrats all in one column, the Republicans all in one column, if everybody's running to be a Democrat, you're not really sure who any of these people are. So you have column 1, you have column 2, and without further context, you would imagine that all of these people are equal. So what happens is the county party bosses, so like the county Democrats or the county Republicans, who have the authority from the county's Board of Elections, determine who they want to run together in a group, and they put them on one line together. So you can see right here, even if you can't read the names, and it would not surprise me if you can't read them because these ballots are so massive that you can't actually look at the whole thing. You can see that column 2 has a whole bunch of names. We have Robert Menendez, who was running for Senate again, even though a lot of people didn't want that. You also had Donald Norcross, Gilbert Wilson, Jeffrey Nash, Susan Shin Angulo, and William Mullen. So all of these candidates were bracketed together. So they wanted to be associated with one another. They were sharing goals, they were sharing political outcomes, and they also each felt that they would have a higher chance of success if they were part of the larger group. So let's say you're running for the Democratic primary, and for some reason you don't agree with the other people on this group. Maybe you're no fan of Bob Menendez. Maybe you don't want to be associated with him. Well, you're probably not going to win because you're not in the favorite group who gets the county line. In this case, column number 2 was the county line. So if you're not part of that, you could all be all the way out in column number 9. And with the way this ballot is lined out, you almost can't see when you're looking at the ballot what this person all the way out here, who is this? John Tomaszewski. I mean, what is he running for? You have to track your eyes all the way back to the left side of this giant ballot to figure it out. And so a lot of complainants who were very upset with this arrangement were calling a place like that ballot Siberia. You're left out in the cold. Very few people ended up voting for these candidates who were banished to ballot Siberia. So the main complaint about this office design was that it was unfair to certain candidates who were not running with the establishment party in the primary. However, it gets worse than that. It's not just about fairness, it also disenfranchised voters. And so here we're going to return to the story of Christine Conforti, who had sued to end the county line. So, I'm sorry, that's not actually the slide. So this is still about unfairness. So I've highlighted 3 names here. So we have 2 different county ballots for people who were running for the same office, the same congressional district. So we have Will Cunningham, Bridget Callahan Harrison, and Amy Kennedy. They were all running for the 2nd congressional district. So you can see I've highlighted their names separately. So the green one is Will Cunningham. He's not in the same column each time. Depending on the county, depending on how they wanted to arrange their grid, these names each ended up being in a different place. So in this one ballot, Amy Kennedy got the county line in Atlantic County, but she did not get it in, I can't even read this, another county, which was in the same district. And there was a study done by New Jersey Policy Perspective, which was trying to figure out, is there a measurable advantage by being on the county line? Does it really matter? And the answer is yes, it does matter. You can see that when Kennedy was in the county line, which meant that she was in column A, along with all those other names, she had 75% of the vote. When she didn't have it, she had 67, but that's because none of these 3 candidates had the county line. When Harrison did not have the line, but she was endorsed, she did even worse. When she had the county line, she did better. And across several comparable races, this study looked at races which were the same candidates across different counties because you could compare these things. She found that on average, there was a 35% difference made by being on that line versus not being on it. So it does make a difference to your chances of getting elected. So that's about candidates. But we're here to talk about users, like voters. And it's not so good for them either. So this is the 2020 Mercer County Democratic primary. And sorry, this is when we return to the story of Christine Conforti. You can see she's in column A, maybe, if you can read it. She happens to be in column A with Joe Biden and Cory Booker. However, there was somebody else running for the same seat in the same column, Stephanie Schmidt. You can see that I've highlighted them now. So you had 2 candidates who were competing with each other, but they were in the same column. And then you had another person competing who was in a different column. You have 3 candidates, but only 2 columns. This was because they had a rule that if you got 40% of some poll that they were taking, they had to put you on the county line, whether you were endorsed by that leadership or not. That's how they ended up with both of them. Oh, I'm sorry. And so what happened was 32% of the votes cast in this election counted as overvoting. That's when you vote for too many people in one contest. So 30%, 32% of the votes cast in this election could not choose the House of Representatives candidate because so many people were just picking every name down the line because that's what the line has been encouraging people to do. Candidates were campaigning and say, vote column A, vote all the way down the column, just check all the names. Except if you do that, you're not voting for either one of them. Your vote doesn't count. So this is a real problem. Not only is it unfair to certain candidates who are not part of the establishment, but it's also unfair to voters because it means their votes are not going to count it because they made a mistake. Now, this was probably mitigated at the polls that were using electronic voting machines because most of those machines will not allow you to choose more than one candidate for the same race unless it's telling you have to pick more than one name. So the technology was making up for some of it. But for people who mailed in ballots, there's nothing stopping you from filling in as many bubbles as you want. And then when they go and count it, if you filled in too many bubbles and they can't figure out who you voted for, you don't get to vote for anybody. So we have a real problem here. So Judge Zahid Qureshi ruled with all of these studies given to him, with the complaints filed by Andy Kim and Sarah Schurengood, and I think it was the New Jersey League of Women Voters also filed a brief. He ruled that the Democrats cannot use this county line ballot design in their ballots anymore starting that year. It's interesting to note that he did not say that the Republicans had to stop because nobody filed a suit. So what happened was the ruling said that you can't bracket the candidates together in any way. So not only can you not have a column and put everybody in it, but you also can't group the candidates together by office, but then say, oh, well, these are the county Democrat endorsed candidates. We're going to make sure they all go to the top. They're not allowed to do that. So you can't position the candidates based on how other candidates were drawn for a different office. You have to draw each candidate randomly for the order so that it's fair. You can't group the candidates together if they're not running for the same office. That's what that column was doing, was putting all these different office candidates together in one block and saying, vote for all these people because they like each other, because we like them. And you have to separate the candidates from others running from the same office. So each candidate for each office block has to get their own cell in the table. Not only that, but they must group the candidates by the office they seek. Now, that is what we call an office block design, and you have to draw them randomly. Great, so that's a lot of do's and don'ts. That doesn't really cover everything. And so that still leaves a lot of room for freedom to design. So in the immediate aftermath of this lawsuit, remember, this was when the 2024 primary was already gearing up to go. Some of the counties complained that, oh, we don't have enough time to fix the ballot before June. It's already in March. This ruling came down in March. And so things looked a little different depending on where you were. At this point, I think it's important to mention that there's a lot of different stakeholder needs present in this situation. So I'd like to introduce the various parties that were involved. So you have the candidates themselves, and many of the candidates were not part of the county endorsed group of Democrats. And so that's the ones who were suing. Those are the ones who were complaining. So they want a chance to be considered equally. You have the smaller parties, like the Working Families Party, who wanted to see their candidates get a chance in the primary. So they're giving a lot of input. You have the voters who want a fair ballot. They want a ballot that they can use. They want a ballot that they can read. And then you have major party leadership, which in some cases was supported by the incumbent candidates because that's how they got there. That's how they won. So they want to keep things the same. So they know that you can't bracket candidates together in a column anymore, but there's a lot of other things you can do. And so the state legislature, even though the judge ruled the injunction against the county boards of elections for that primary, and only for that primary, it was an injunction. It wasn't a, this is what you must do forever. So even though it wasn't like that, the state legislature decided that because the nature of the ruling was about the state constitution, that they'd better do something about it. And so they held committee hearings. They put together an assembly select committee, and they wanted to hear from the public. However, when you ask the public a question like this, who's really motivated to show up? It's the candidates. It's the smaller parties. It's the major leadership. So that's who we were hearing from in these hearings, where people were giving expert testimony, where they were giving personal testimony and accounts of things. In the meantime, you had some really fun stuff going on with the June 24 primary. This one was from Burlington County. This was actually from my town. This is what I got to see when I voted. And so you can see you have the office block, and then everybody who's running for that office is together, and they decided they were going to do it for the Democrats and the Republicans. However, Hudson County didn't. So you just have two different designs. And they continued to use slogans because they knew that even if you can't group everybody together in a column, if you give them a slogan, you can label them all and say, oh, this one's with the Hudson County Democratic Organization. Andy Kim is also with the Hudson County Democratic Organization. So is Rob Menendez. And so when you're looking, you can see, oh, who should I vote for? Oh, the county Democrats. Oh, yeah, that's who they recommend. I should do that. So we had 6 public hearings seeking testimony from input from the experts and also the public. And then bipartisan county officials who had run the most recent primary were asked to testify and talk about how it went to have new ballots. And at this time, I think it's useful to introduce Whitney Quisenberry, who is the executive director of the Center for Civic Design. And so she testified and gave her expert input to this committee as a UX designer. One of the most useful resources that I think her organization has put out is called a checklist for usable ballots. I'm just going to offer you the address here because the checklist is so long that we don't really have time to go through the whole thing. This is a really quick overview of the topics that it covers. So the checklist is a list of questions that you want to answer to judge whether you've designed a usable ballot. So is it clear and easy to read? Is it consistently designed throughout the ballot? Does it avoid bias? Is there a clear separation of contests? That means, are the people who are running for different offices separated from each other? That's what we talked about earlier. The contests can't be too close to the ballot instructions. So when you're reading the ballot, you don't miss a contest because it was stuck all the way up there with the instructions on how to use the ballot. It needs to be easy to navigate. It has to have all the information that a voter needs to cast a vote. Those instructions need to be written clearly. It has to support language access requirements. I don't know if you could see it, but several of these ballots already were multilingual, depending on what languages were deemed to be in need of accessibility for various counties. And those questions have to have clear, legible language in whatever language they are printed. So let's talk about bias. These are visual signs of bias. And I bring this up because during the hearings, and I attended one of them, there were many people, I hate saying that, who were urging the legislature to legislate away the ability to do these things because they were afraid that the establishment parties would do whatever they can to maintain the status quo. That they would say, well, we can't use columns, but we want to make sure that voters are voting for the right people. So we're going to mark the names differently. We're going to give a more solid line between our favorite one and the rest of them. We're going to make sure they always go to the top. We're going to give them a bigger block in the office block design. So here are spelled out some examples of this happening. So you might have a bold line dividing your candidates. You might have bolder or larger text indicating the county party's endorsed candidate. You might have different marking places for different candidates. If you don't say they can't do that, they could do it. And giving different amounts of vertical space to different candidates. So I mocked up a little bit of what this might look like. So on the left, we have one candidate who has really obviously bigger cell than the rest of them. And they're hoping that maybe just your visual bias will see that and you'll think it's different, and then you'll put more consideration to it. That might mean that you're more likely to choose that. On the right, we have a very thick black line dividing the top candidate from the rest of them. So these are just some things that you could do. At this time, I think it's important to consider that not everybody was agreeing what is best. There was a lot of discussion of what voters need, what voters deserve, how can we make the best ballot for voters? But many of the arguments that were presented were actually advocating on behalf of other people involved in the process, like the parties, like the candidates. So the establishment party was arguing that what would be best for voters is that they need to be nudged, they need to be shown who they should vote for. They need to have curated or vetted recommendations. Then we had other candidates who were not establishment candidates arguing that it needs to be fair. What voters want is fairness, and that every choice on the ballot needs to be equally weighted, equally considered, so that all you have to do is consider the name. Is it best for voters or is it best for the candidates? There's a lot of discussion about slogans. So the Working Families Party, the UX designers that attended the call with me, we were all arguing that slogans are no better than visual bracketing, that they are offering a bias and encouraging voters to vote for the establishment candidate because they're all sharing the same slogan, that the slogan offers the counties to do what they've always done, because you can't get the slogan unless you're part of the group. You know, you have to come up with a different one if they don't consent. On the other hand, there was also discussion about voters not having enough information until they see the ballot, and that they need some clue about who it is they want to vote for. Like maybe you would want to know that Andy Kim and Sarah Schoengood share the same goals, that they've been campaigning together. Maybe you need to be reminded of that when you see the ballots. So you have these competing arguments that are claiming to argue on behalf of voters. But I think it's really not clear that it's only about voters. It's also about candidates, isn't it? Because, you know, either you want it to be fair because you think that'll give you a better shot at winning, or you think it needs to be more stacked because that gives you a better shot at winning. So after all of these hearings, the legislature met several times and revised the bill several times. And I just found the final version of the bill had been put out, I think, on the 27th of February, and it was signed by the governor. So that was signed on March 6th. So this is what we got in the end. So these are highlights that I got from reading this, I don't know, 30-page bill. It's really hard to read, but here's the breakdown. So you can't have any candidate names visually standing out from the others. So you can't make it any bigger, you can't make it any bolder than anybody else's, you can't put somebody in italics, things like that. Office block format, so everybody that's running for the same office has to be together. You can't have any page break between these names. Now, this matters because if any of you have designed something for a fixed page before, you know that space is an issue. You know, sometimes you run out of space and there's nothing you can do except put stuff to the next line. Well, the law now says you can't do that. So you're going to have to find some other way to get everybody on the page. Maybe that means you're going to make the page even bigger. Maybe that means you're going to have 2 sides for your ballot. But the one thing you can't do is take a long list of candidates who are running from the same office and break them up. Because there's a really big chance that somebody on the second half of that list is not going to get any votes because the voters don't recognize that they're voting for the same thing. All these office blocks must be designed the same as each other. So you can't make the president one any more important. You can't, set aside the school board one and say, oh, this one's special. You can't do that. The office blocks need to be clearly separated from one another. Again, this runs into concerns about space. Clearly separated is the language that they use. So there's still some room there about what that means. And all the text must be in plain, simple language. Now, if any of you have ever answered a public question before, you would know that this is a big change because a lot of these questions are written in a very dense way. And then there's also an interpretation right next to them, because if you read the statute or the proposition as it was written, like, you don't really know what they're talking about. So the text must be plain, simple language. And that is a quote from the bill. Now let's talk about the slogans. Despite all the complaints that still persist, the slogans are allowed. They must be 6 words or fewer. They have to be the same font as the candidate name, but smaller. So that means that you can't put higher priority on making sure people see the slogans and making sure people see who the county party selected than seeing the names. You also can't put those slogans in a bold font or an italicized font. So we're really downplaying the visual impact of the slogans, even though they're still there. Candidates associating with each other can share the slogans. That's kind of how you have the leftovers of this bracketing phenomenon. Slogans indicating endorsement by a person or organization need consent from that party, so that you can't claim somebody's endorsing you when they really don't. And that consent can be revoked before the deadline that would come before it has to go to print. When it's too late, it's too late. And the slogans are first come, first serve. You can't copy somebody else's slogan. Now this, I think, is about an actual slogan and not a slogan that's just the name of the group that endorses you. So if you said, we care about families, the next person who wants to do that, who's not associating with you, can't pick that. They have to pick something else. Now let's talk about position. They ruled that each candidate has to be drawn randomly out of a box. They said, like, 61 days before the election, at 3 o'clock, it's going to be out of a physical box. They're going to write your name and put it in the box. However, if you want to associate with somebody running for the same office, so this might be relevant for something like a school board election where you have to vote for multiple people, but you have a longer list of that. If you want to be together with another candidate, the 2 of you or more, everybody who's in that little group, they only get 1 name in the box. So that means that you wouldn't necessarily have the big chunk of them at the top. They still have to go through the random drawing. So you can't just say, like, oh, well, because we have a bigger group, it belongs at the top, which I think is something that a lot of us designers would assume, right? I think that's a pretty common thing to do, to say, like, oh, big group because it's different than the rest of the things. We would want to make sure that it's set aside so that you can understand it. But no, in the interest of fairness, they might be at the bottom because they have to draw randomly. And then each office has the drawing. So if candidates are running together in a party, just because one of them got the top position, it doesn't mean any of the other ones get the top position. They each have to do the drawing. And so many of us who were advocating for fully fair ballots didn't get everything we wanted. But I do think it's a really good step forward. I think it's a pretty good compromise. Personally, I saw voters at the 2024 primary struggle with the new ballot because they were so used to just voting down the column that they really did ask out loud, who am I supposed to vote for? I'm not gonna lie, I heard this from outside the curtain. They said, who am I supposed to vote for? And so there was a strong impulse in these assembly select committee discussions to accommodate the transition between voters who were getting informed at the ballot box towards more civically engaged voters who might do their research ahead of time. And yet, you know, we did get rid of this grid. It had been there for 60 years. There were people complaining about it for 60 years. And we finally did something. And they asked the public. They asked people like me and Josephine, what do you think? And we got to say what we think. And they took it into consideration. They sought expert testimony from people like Whitney Quisenberry. And as I understand it, she was contracted to consult with them further after the hearing that we attended. The bill that I read mentions her contributions to the final bill. And so this is an example of a hotly contested set of decisions with multiple factors to consider, multiple stakeholders, competing interests that may directly conflict with one another. And I think that this story really tells us a lot about how to handle situations like these, because you can talk all day about what you think users need, but many of the people who are speaking on their behalf also have their own goals in mind. And I think it's really important to separate cleanly, you know, what is for the user, what is for this department, what is for the business goals, what is for the marketing, what is for retention, etc. So I'd like to hear from you. Have you been in similar situations? How do you feel about how this played out? Do you think that this could tell you anything about how to proceed in your own organizations when you have to advocate for users? And so many other people in the room think they're advocating for users, and maybe they're not. So I open up the floor to you.
All right, first off, thank you for this talk. This is actually the best explanation that I've heard of this county line situation.
Oh.
So I definitely feel like I understand it a lot better. As far as similar situations, last November, my hometown, West Windsor, they had a public question where there was a group within the town that wanted to switch West Windsor from nonpartisan to partisan elections. So in a nonpartisan election, you don't have to run with an established political party, and you don't have to have a political party's name next to your name. But in a partisan election, you have to pick an established political party and run with them and have the party label next to your name. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the people who were in favor of partisan elections were using the same sorts of arguments that we heard here about, oh, well, voters need, just like with the slogans, voters need the party name so that they're informed. They need to know who they're supposed to vote for. They need this extra information here so that they know. And fortunately for everybody, that group lost by like 2/3. Like nobody wanted partisan elections. So that's kind of a similar situation. And it's interesting to hear those same sorts of arguments being used in relation to this case, just like to that one.
Yeah, I think that does ring true. Actually, I remember my own mom talking about the school board candidates and the county council, not the county, the town council candidates, and asking, like, yeah, but are they a Democrat or a Republican? Because they're all talking about lowering taxes, but I don't really know what they mean until I hear the label. Because, you know, what if one of them supports this other candidate that I can't stand? And I thought, like, well, then I guess you have to read their materials and you have to listen to what they have to say about it. But yeah, I can see where you're coming from. That does sound kind of dicey.
So I think my takeaway is that this thing was 60 years old, said,
or more,
and it was just really poorly designed by people that didn't think about what we think about today. Or this question, what is your feeling on either this particular tool or other tools where they're purposely designed with malicious intent? Are we seeing that in places anywhere? It had to be from either part.
Sure. I think malicious intent is a really strong descriptor of this. I think maybe self-motivated intent, or, you know, just wanting to conserve your own power intent is probably sufficient. I think. Do we have any other tools that are like this? Are you talking specifically about the world of partisan elections, or are you also talking about things like business needs?
No, just the way these colors
Mm.
created.
Mhm.
The ones that are 60 years old, having excuses about those with the culture. Something that's created maybe within the last 10 years, or redesigned in the last 10 years,
Mm.
may have more manipulation to one side.
Well, the interesting thing about this is that the ruling specifically refers to the primary elections. So if you're asking, was this one side or another, and I think maybe you're talking about Democrats versus Republicans, it sounds like that's actually not the relevant issue here. It's more about, establishment Democrats versus, what should we call them? Less established progressive parties, for example. Like smaller parties that want to run on the Democratic ticket, but they're facing obstacles to that. I mean, the truth is, if we didn't have such a strong two-party system, this part wouldn't be so necessary. But they feel that it is, that if they're not on the Democratic ticket, they'll get even less consideration in the general election. So they're trying to get on the ticket. Or perhaps Republican parties that are very specific in their scope, libertarians, or people who just want lower taxes, but they're not interested in social conservatism, things like that. In the general election, they are keeping that grid. And I don't actually know how they're deciding, who's getting the first column, but they expect you to read that. If you just voted the first column and that was Republicans and you didn't want it, I think that's too bad. You gotta read a little bit. But it is true that even in a democracy, the mechanisms of government that we have do trend towards people in power seeking to maintain their own power to stop other people from getting it. I mean, with the 35% point percentage advantage that they got with the county line, you can bet almost everybody who's sitting in office had the advantage. So why would they want to get rid of it? That same study also found that incumbency was the greatest determiner of winning or not. Like almost no incumbents got voted out. But if it's working for you, you don't really want to get. And I think that holds true across many areas of life.
Are there maybe this is not pertaining to this specific case or New Jersey specific, but is there any insight given to other states maybe have like ranked choice voting? I know like in primaries that's also like a big thing right now. Is there any kind of design concerns around ballots for that?
That's actually something I don't know a lot about, ranked choice voting. I would imagine that many of the design constraints are the same, that you would want the office block ballot.
Right.
It may simply be that the areas for marking your intent have to look different. Like maybe they have something like 3 bubbles and the leftmost bubble is your first choice, something like that, or they expect you to write the number. Then the difference between writing with a pen to mark the ballots versus using some kind of electronic marking device, that would also present different design constraints. I think it's pretty remarkable to me that so many of the sample ballots that I was looking at did not actually have the bubble or the square or any indication about where you should mark your choice. They just had the cell for the name and the slogan. And I thought like, okay, well, where's the bubble? How am I going to know when to mark this? That is probably because they wanted to print one sample ballot that would still be useful to people who would later get a mail-in ballot or people who would then go to the machine. Like I understand that if you got the mail-in ballot in the mail, you're not getting the sample one, but these were samples that were made available online. So they wanted to have like one universal source of truth. And so they probably found that it was more useful to them to simply publish it without including the actual marking space.
Question. I missed this part, but has there been an update to design the ballot on our county as user passes what's that traffic?
There actually is a provision in this bill to do reporting of results. Whether that really counts as user testing or not, I'm not sure. However, Whitney Quisenberry and the Center for Civic Design did publish some guidance that not every aspect of designing the ballot ought to be fully legislated, that you need to give counties some room to determine how they're going to solve their problems themselves. So I don't think that rules out the possibility of involving UX designers at the county level or even performing user testing, but it did not outright require them to do this either. Again, even the final bill, it sounds like it's really comprehensive and it's legislating every aspect of designing these things, but it's still not everything. There's still plenty of room for these things to be different, and they're going to be different across the counties. Did you still have your question?
Yeah, I was just curious, why did ballots have, like, they do, like Google form or something like that, but, you know what I mean?
Like a Google form.
Okay, could you repeat the question? I'm curious why ballots have to have this sort of, stark black and white bureaucratic look versus like modern surveys.
Well, I think a big part of that is because they are printed on paper. And so, especially some of the delineations, they need to be really clear so that you can actually see, you know, where the information is and where it isn't. If you had, you know, softer lines or drop shadow, it wouldn't be as easy to find the block. And you have to remember that it also has to be accessible to all ages. You know, older voters, you know, they may really need to put their glasses on. They may have contrast requirements. And however imperfect it may be, it looks to me as though they're at least trying to accommodate these needs. Whereas making it look cool might make all of those things a lot worse. Do you have any other questions?
Was just curious, again, maybe not to this particular case, but any insights you have into, or were there any, or have there been any hiccups when it comes to, you know, I know New Jersey, I think ballots are allowed to, you can request ballots in other languages as well. I think it's something that's like 7 or 8, I think at this point. Just any insights you have, like, you know, are there any kind of UX constraints in that regard, or is anything to kind of keep in mind? Like, I know, for example, I think here in New Jersey, one of the languages that you like the ballots can be requested in is Arabic, right? So like that, you know, you're reading from right to left instead of left to right. So I don't know if you have insights there, if there's any kind of interesting points.
I'm so sorry. I actually did find one when I was looking for sample ballots to include in my slides that had the Arabic writing.
Oh.
And so it was, you know, like English and Arabic on the same ballot. And it just made all of these columns just a bit longer because they had 2 languages on them. Is there a form of Arabic that is written left to right to be more amenable to sharing formatting with English?
Not to my knowledge.
Oh, well then I guess they just had to put it below, and then you're gonna know that you have to read it that way. I think that ballot tended to have centered text. Like it wasn't left justified or right justified. In those ballots, everything was just like right down the middle.
Got it.
And, you know, I had thought that for English, the centered text was not quite as easy to read in English, but you brought up a really interesting point that it might be better at accommodating Arabic if it has to be read in the other direction. Like it's a compromise between the 2 of them.
Right. Because I would assume, like, you know, if it's like Spanish and French that's written in, you know, like the same alphabet that we use compared to, you know, in English, you know, there might not be that much of a you know, contrast or compared to like you said, left justified, right justified, whatever the case may be.
Sure. I think that's going to continue to be a challenge for county boards of elections forever, unless they decide that they just want to stop having multilingual ballots.
Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things that Whitney Quisenberry has talked about and you talked about was I guess it's maybe as the tension between codifying all of the details in the legislation versus specifying standards that could be then interpreted by the county clerks when they design the ballots. It sounds to me like the most recent information from the state is that they did a kind of mix and match thing where they put some things into the legislation and left other things to be applied and interpreted by the county clerks. Would that be a fair assessment?
Oh, yeah. And in the final version of the bill, they included statutes, you might call them, like 2A, A1 in the hierarchy of things. There's actually a bunch of things that were marked as having been taken out. So they were there, and now they're not there. We had
Good.
yeah, it shows that they really were considering it. They had a version that said that all text shall be in lowercase letters with capitalization allowed for the first letter of a word. All text shall be aligned to the left. The font shall be in a sans serif typeface and a size of at least 12 points for printed ballots and at least between 3 and 4 millimeters for ballots that appear on a screen. And so all three of these things are not in the final ballot design bill. And I actually wonder if maybe that was due to input from Whitney Quisenberry, or if it was simply debated on the floor, or if county clerks had input and they said, oh, we can't do that. We have these concerns. We need this to be available for us because of this and that constraint.
Or maybe your testimony or my testimony, or maybe they just had more time to think about it.
Maybe.
The other thing I wanted to ask about was, one of the things that was talked about was the concept of ballot rotation versus choosing an order randomly. It sounds like ballot rotation didn't make it into the final recommendations, right?
I don't think so.
It didn't make it in.
I didn't see that. No.
So they could want to continue to choose randomly by whatever method they've been using in the past.
I actually don't know if it is the same method that they've been using in the past, but they did spell out exactly what they want the method to be. They said it's going to be the county. Oh, where is it? They made an accommodation for the fact that some elections are run by municipal entities rather than county. So they were saying county or municipality as it happens to apply, but that they have to do it in public, that any member of the public should be allowed to attend this public drawing, that it's going to be in a box. They set a box, and it's got to be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, this many days before the election. And, they specified that if you want to bracket together with another candidate, the X number of you only gets one card in the box. So they tried to spell it out as much as you can.
Interesting to me because having talked to someone who ran for office many years ago, depending on the method used, there is a way to introduce, let's call it bias, into the process. So that's part of why I, had an interest as to what methods what that actual business process is. So I guess since the ballot rotation didn't get into the final version, there's still potentially room for that. Unfortunately, right?
There is room for that, but I think there's also still room for improvement in later bills. And this is partly because the bill included a requirement that the Division of Elections in the Department of State shall collect data from county and municipal clerks and county boards of elections on their experiences regarding the changes to ballot design and primary election procedures in the state implemented pursuant to the number of the bill, and shall develop and submit a report as provided in this section. The report shall include data concerning the conduct of primary elections, best practices to improve the conduct of future primary elections, and any other relevant information, research, guidance, and expertise regarding the implementation of the new ballot designs and primary elections procedures. So in preparing the report required pursuant to this section, the division shall, at a minimum, collect data on the following: experiences of election officials, candidates, and voters regarding the changes, including whether such changes contributed to candidate or voter confusion or increased the difficulty for election officials to administer those primary elections in the state, what the costs of implementation were. At the discretion of the division, they may also provide the governor and legislature with recommendations to improve overall election experiences and voter participation. And they include, when they have to submit the report. So that could mean one of two things. It could mean that they are open to improvement in the direction that UX designers would like, or it also means they could be open to changing things to be more like the way they were if the boards of elections don't like what they've been told they have to do. Whether that actually means there's going to be changes made to the bill in a further bill only listening to those parties, I can't say. Like, given the amount of input they were taking from the public, I should think that it would be really unfair to turn around and then undo it without input from the public. But they're listening, and that to me is a good thing.
So I just want to say, I follow this a little bit, not very much, because it's just a lot.
I'm sorry.
No, but no,
It is a
not you.
lot.
I mean, this whole, just when this was happening.
Oh, yeah.
Committee and things like that. I mean, what's interesting is, like, even now, county chairs are sending out like letters for like slogan adoption to the Division of Elections, I suppose it is. And they actually use the term like bracket them under this slogan. And I'm like, well, it's not really a bracket, it's an adoption of a slogan by multiple candidates in multiple spots, right?
I mean, that tells you their intent, right?
Yeah. But with that said, I think what's so I'm a county committee member in my county, and it's interesting to me because I think from the user perspective as well, like they're like the average primary voter, like you have to assume, right, that primary voters are already higher engaged than those who just come out to the general.
Yep.
They don't understand the process of county committees at all, and how every single county committee differs depending on where you are. So, for example, in my county, we don't even directly vote on the candidates, right? We vote, the chair has sole discretion to be able to decide, who gets the line, or who did get the line, who gets the slogan now, I should say, and who gets the actual, party endorsement and financial support that may come with that. But, but we do vote on that chair.
Right.
And the voters vote on us.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting to me, and I'll say that's point 3. But like point 2 is like, there's like so much focus on there's so much focus on the ballot design. I guess this sort of interrelates. There's so much focus on the ballot design when it comes to the primary ballot. But when it comes to our elected positions within the party that then wind up then having further votes that are to, for example, determine at our county conventions, if you're a convention where your vote, counts directly toward the total that a candidate receives, that's not publicly funded. And it's not publicly funded where we decide our chairs or our leaders and things like that. it's not publicly funded, and also by extension, we don't have any sense of election security as a result of that. In my county in particular, our bylaws specifically state that votes for the chairship, for example, are to be done electronically. So what that means is that it's the staff of the county party under the chair conducting that vote. But like in reality here, when we do go to a primary, we don't have somebody's chief of staff. Like we don't have a senator's chief of staff sitting there tallying the votes of the public. But for on that same primary voted seats, when we cast our votes within our county, that's being conducted, and that's something that nobody has talked about really. And I just find that really interesting because that to me seems like what is the user intent at the end of the day? Is it to have their voice funneled through us as their district representative, to be able to have an advisement? Or is it for us to advise for the chair and have the chair have the advisement? Or is the user intent to have none of it? And in which case you would have a primary ballot where there's no slogans at all, right? And that's, I think, the most difficult question when it comes to the UX is which is always the case, right? The user doesn't always know what they want.
So I would like you to clarify,
Yeah,
hopefully for the microphone,
yeah.
who is the user as
Well,
you're speaking right now?
Well, the user would be the voter.
The
right?
voter. I
Yeah.
think it's important to say that out loud.
Yeah,
Because when you're having these more closed door elections, were you talking about the users of those elections, the people who are voting in those, or are we talking about the general
right.
voting electorate when they get to the polls in June?
Yeah, anyone who is a registered of
Yeah.
one party or the other
Yeah.
voter.
Yeah, I think it is a really complicated question about what would best serve them. And I do agree with you now that you've brought it up that, that half of the process is not very transparent at all. In fact, it took me until a couple days before this presentation to find out that it was the county committees who were determining, who was getting the line, because every time I was reading about this, I was like, the county party decides the line. I'm like, okay, and who is that? And how do they figure it out? Like, is there somebody taking money?
Right.
It really was not easy to find that information. And, I spent days and days looking for it.
Yeah.
Imagine the rest of us who are not spending days and days looking for it. How would we know?
Yeah. And since we're on the microphone, I have to qualify. I'm not saying that there's fraud taking place, but I'm just saying.
Oh, I didn't think you were.
No, I know. But I'm very just since we're on recording. But it's just like that's so strange to me. The schism where it's so important to have us be on a primary ballot, which is state funded, but then when it comes to our votes as a committee, that's not state funded. That's what's weird about that to me. We have no talk about a ballot design for candidates within the committee, or anything along those lines. Because depending on where you are, you could vote via proxy, right?
Right.
You can submit votes. There's no standardized procedure.
Maybe that's also about entrenched power, because if they had to provide the funding, could they truly, in all fairness, restrict such funding to only certain Democrats and only certain Republicans? What's stopping a true third party from, popping up and demanding the money?
Well, people have that is that.
Sure.
Too many good parties receive state funding and third parties don't. That I have heard.
Right. But, they would have to legislate that aspect of it if they really didn't want third parties to have it. They would say, only these parties can have it. And then would that not be undermining democracy in the state at large to really codify that it can only be two parties?
I think
As entrenched as they are, maybe that's a step too far.
I think it is codified because I think there is a minimum standard. I don't know if it's, I think it may be based on registered voters within the state, and this is across multiple states. I think that there is technically a threshold, but it's just none of the third parties meet that legislatively defined threshold.
Right, it's already hard enough.
Right.
Yeah. These are
Sorry,
really
that's a lot,
interesting
but
questions
yeah.
that I don't have answers to, but I don't think you want me to have answers to them. I think they're just good questions to be asking and thinking about. And so now that I've given you all a lot to think about, I shall sign off and let you enjoy the next presentation.